A suicide bomber has killed 170 people and wounded another 200 after carrying out a terrorist attack outside Kabul's international airport. The tragic event unfolded as thousands of people tried to escape the country with mass evacuations underway, part of the overall effort of withdrawal by US troops from America's longest war. In the lead-up to the tragic attack, Australia, Britain, and the US all warned their citizens to stay away from the airport, saying that an attack was imminent. Now some are asking, how come the US and its allies didn't do more to secure the perimeter if they did indeed have prior knowledge of an impending attack? Others are asking, why did the US abandon its biggest airbase, Bagram, just a month before? And could that have potentially contributed to such a security situation? Let's take a closer look. I'm Richard Medhurst and you're watching the Communiqué. As part of the withdrawal agreement signed in February 2020 by then US President Donald Trump, the United States was set to leave Afghanistan on May 1st, 2021. It did not. Instead, US President Joe Biden pushed the deadline forward to September 11th, marking the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, and then back to August 31st. It said that in order to avoid a Saigon moment, a repeat of the humiliating withdrawal from Vietnam in 1975, the US moved all evacuation operations from its embassy in Kabul to Kabul's international airport. Air traffic control and all operations at the airport were taken over by US forces, effectively grinding all commercial flights to a halt. Now, some people, like Eric Prince, the founder of the infamous Blackwater mercenary group which committed numerous war crimes in Iraq, are even trying to exploit the situation by offering people a ticket out of the country, but only if they cough up around $6,500 for a seat on a plane. The lines are long, the crowds are packed, people are desperate to get out of the country that the US claims it was building and bettering for 20 years. And in the early hours of August 26th, there were warnings from the British, American, and Australians that a terrorist attack at Kabul airport was imminent. These warnings, unfortunately, turned out to be true, and a suicide bomber blew themselves up amidst a crowd of people, tragically killing 170 Afghans, 13 US Marines, and wounding 200 people. And even though the majority of victims are Afghans, you wouldn't really know that if you only paid attention to what Western media are saying. In what can only be described as American arrogance, many headlines, tweets, and messages of outrage and concern do not even mention the Afghans killed who make up most of the victims. You know, these stories seem to completely omit this in their headlines, focusing heavily instead on the US Marines, asking you to pray for them, as if they are the only victims worth mentioning, and the Afghans aren't worth praying for. You even had outrageous, hate-filled messages like this one of people calling for Afghan villages to be wiped off the face of the earth for every American life. It's always interesting in moments like these to see the mask come off the people who claim the US is supposedly helping Afghanistan or occupying it for humanitarian reasons. Unfortunately, this gruesome and barbaric attack is not an isolated incident. It is a tragic reminder of the entire war on Afghanistan, because not just yesterday, but for the last 20 years, many people have been killed, many people have been wounded and suffered as a result of US imperialism. Since the beginning of this year alone, in the last 7 months, almost 1,700 Afghans were killed. Did you hear about any of that in the news? The mainstream media only seem to care about victims when they are NATO troops or Western citizens, because their lives are somehow worth more than anyone else's. Their entire coverage has focused primarily on how bad the withdrawal is, precisely so you forget how bad the war is. They don't want to talk about Guantanamo Bay, Abu Ghraib, the CIA kidnapping and torturing people, the executions, the war crimes by British, American, and Australian troops. This is deeply embarrassing and shameful for them and blows their entire narrative about nation building and counterterrorism out of the water. So instead they try to distract you with this withdrawal so you forget the war crimes. All week, the Department of Defense has been posting pure propaganda showing photographs of US soldiers giving water to Afghans or holding Afghan babies, right? As if those same NATO troops weren't the ones who killed and maimed over 26,000 children between 2005 and 2019, right? Like we're just supposed to forget about all these war crimes and crimes against humanity and all the victims and refugees they created over 20 years of war because of some pictures of bottled water. What a cheap attempt to try and whitewash their crimes. And immediately after this attack at Kabul airport, General H.R. McMaster went on CNN for an interview. McMaster used to be the national security advisor under Trump, and he represents the typical warhawk neocon ghouls who inhabit the national security blob in D.C. McMaster went on CNN, and take a look at what he had to say.
I would not be surprised in any way if ISIS-K was used, this attack, their Kabul attack network was used as a cutout for the Taliban, so they can humiliate us on the way out and still continue to play us.
And if you know nothing about Afghanistan and you know nothing about Daesh and the Taliban, which is most of CNN's audience, then you might be inclined to believe this man who boasts a long career in the military and is on TV wearing a suit and a tie. But his claim that the Taliban is somehow behind this attack is simply ridiculous and fantasy. The Taliban want to finish this war and for all foreign NATO invaders to leave Afghanistan as soon as possible. The last thing on earth that the Taliban is going to do is execute a suicide mission, kill 13 Marines, not to mention dozens of their own people, hundreds of their own people, and risk prolonging the war or escalating the conflict with the US. Not to mention the very obvious fact that the Taliban and Daesh are enemies. So why on earth would they be working together, let alone on such an endeavor at this time? Again, this is such an absurd statement that only someone who knows nothing about the region could believe. This is very reminiscent of 2002 and 2003, of how the US lied about Saddam Hussein having ties to Al-Qaeda, even though the two were also enemies. This was a complete fabrication, a lie, in order to implicate him in the war on terror and try and justify an invasion of Iraq. In another example, just last year in the summer of 2020, the mainstream media claimed that Russia and Iran had placed bounties on US soldiers in Afghanistan and were basically paying the Taliban thousands of dollars to kill US forces. And of course, this story turned out to be completely fake, because that's what it is. It's a baseless lie. And nevertheless, it was successfully used by the politicians in Washington, D.C. to prolong the war in Afghanistan. Despite the fact that at the time, many people warned how improbable and fake the story sounded, not to mention that its sources were unnamed intelligence officials who, needless to say, have a never-ending list of lies that they have told for political gain. So perfectly in line with these numerous past examples, General McMaster goes on CNN and makes up an outrageous lie, claiming the Taliban and Daesh, who are enemies, work together to attack the US. The only reason people like him say this, and the only reason networks like CNN allow him to say this, is because they hope to prolong the war. They love war. They love the ratings, the money, and the expansion of US hegemony, and that's precisely why they do it. We'll be right back after this short break. Well, Dr. Wahab, an Afghan-American professor who's taught at Lewis and Clark College, he was also the senior advisor to the Minister of Higher Education in Afghanistan for 5 years, from 2002 to 2007. He joins me now to discuss the situation further. First of all, thank you so much for coming on the program, Professor. It's great to have you.
You're quite welcome. Thank you for having me.
So, Professor, could I just get your initial reaction on this very tragic event, this attack that took place at Kabul airport? Why did this happen? Who stands to benefit from this?
Well, it's sad, it's tragic, and it's outrageous in my view. The coverage by the corporate press has been even worse because, for the ever since August 15th, when the Taliban took over the country, the entire focus of the corporate media has been on the airport, without any context, without any history, without background, without explanation, without analysis, without depth, as if the airport events, which were manufactured by the United States and its allies, as if they took place in a vacuum. There's no talk about how the United States and its allies actually deliberately created this crisis. But also there's no explanation of the direct contribution by the previous Afghan government of Mr. Ghani and before that, Mr. Karzai. So while I feel very sorry for the people and the 170 plus people who were killed and the hundreds who were injured, I feel very sorry and very sad, both for the expatriates who were killed and maimed and also for the Afghans. Amongst them were, I'm sure, some very important, qualified, useful people, but they're gone. And also, there's no question being asked, how and why this came about. And the responsibility is directly with Washington and its allies, because Washington has been meddling in Afghan affairs ever since the 1970s. While I should point out that Afghanistan had nothing to do with the crime and tragedy of 9/11, and yet the United States in October of 2001, started assaulting, bombing, and occupying the country, and occupied it since August 15th. So I think, while I feel sorry for the people at the airport, and they should be helped in every way, but one, we should hold the United States and allies directly responsible, and two, we should provide for a context, and three, my question is, what about the 34 million Afghans who will be left behind? Suppose the United States and its allies, quote, rescue, maybe 500,000 Afghans right now at maximum, but there are 34 million people who are, destined to stay there. And what about them, their lives? Because, as you know, the banks are closed. There's no money. The United States, has declared an embargo. So has the IMF, the World Bank. The government employees have not been paid, from 2 to 6 months before the Taliban were even in the picture. So I think we need to sort of put this in the larger context. And of course, the United States, Washington needs, these such scenes in trauma, so that Washington can feel good and charitable and helpful, but also so that it can justify to the American public why and how it went in, and why and how it got out, without consulting anybody or without considering, the larger picture.
And Professor, when as you say that they need such scenes, do you think that the United States or its NATO allies will exploit what just happened to maybe, some people are saying they might send in more troops or start conducting, expanding the war on terror? Do you think that they're going to do what they did in Iraq? They go back in under the guise of counterterrorism, or going to Syria?
Well, as you know, the war continues. President Biden himself said that the war over the horizon, as he put it, will continue. And we know that the United States was bombing, actually. And then 2 days yesterday, the bombing of the two Daesh members in Nangarhar, which is understandable. But I worry because Afghanistan is so strategically located, and because the United States needs Afghanistan for its resources, its geostrategic position, and also its competition and rivalry with China, Iran, and Russia. So I don't think that the United States and its so-called allies are going to sort of leave Afghanistan alone. So that's one thing. The other thing, of course, is that the United States invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, in my view, is not the first one, and it's not the last one, because it's called imperialism and neocolonialism. We all know what the United States has done in Central America, in Chile, in Cuba, in Central America, in Nicaragua, and in Asia and the South African, in Iraq, Yemen, Somalia, in Lebanon, and other places. So it's called, the United States is determined actually to keep destabilizing nations and nation states who are trying to modernize themselves, and also to delink themselves, their economies, societies, and cultures from Western Orientalist, Eurocentrist, and Islamophobia. And the United States simply cannot allow this. So I'm afraid the United States, directly or indirectly, will continue meddling in Afghan affairs. And it's also interesting that someone in Washington said the other day that the Taliban should also involve the members of the former government. Now, we all know what Mr. Ghani did and his team, and how much money they stole, and is living happily in Dubai. And it looks, I think the Taliban are going to be facing several challenges. One would be the members of the warlords and also the previous Afghan government, who have accumulated an enormous amount of money. They can hire any number of mercenaries and meddle the Taliban. And two, internally, as you know, Afghanistan is a very divided country. It's a very heterogeneous society. And I'm afraid that there's going to be inter-ethnic conflict, but also maybe the main conflict could be between the Pashtun, the Taliban, the Pashtuns on the one hand, and the Tajiks, Uzbeks, and Hazaras on the other hand.
You know, speaking of the Taliban, you had people like General McMaster going on CNN and saying that they worked, Taliban allegedly worked with ISIS, with Daesh to do this attack. I mean, they're enemies, are they not? How does that make sense? And
we should all, again, like if you look at Daesh or ISIS, and in this case called ISIS Khorasan. Khorasan means it's a former name for Afghanistan and Pakistan. But we all know that ISIS and Daesh came into being with the support of the United States in Iraq. The United States sort of provided for the emergence of the Daesh and was supporting it, and Daesh was fighting for the United States in Syria. So, and of course, but I think we should not confuse the Taliban with others, either whether it's Daesh or Tehrik-e-Taliban or the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan or the Eastern Turkestan, the Uyghurs in China. The Taliban are mostly Pashtuns, they're Afghans, they're indigenous to Afghanistan, and they have no broader international agenda beyond the borders of the Afghan. They have been on a record for repeatedly saying we have no global agenda, and they should not be. I think it's wrong to sort of project them as quote terrorists, because these are, they want to free their country. I mean, if someone occupies your home, I think you're entitled to, defend your home, and you shouldn't be named this or that. So, as we know, as far as we know, there has been strong competition. In fact, I remember reading about skirmishes between the Taliban and also the Daesh, Khorasan, in Nangarhar, Kunar, and Nuristan province in the southeast of Afghanistan, because the two are directly opposite. The Daesh actually accuses the Taliban of being too soft on the West, but also believing in negotiations and a peaceful settlement of conflict, when the Taliban are arguing that Daesh is too extreme, non-discriminatory, and has a global agenda, and are, in a way, sort of terrorist organizations. So I don't think, not only the Taliban would not cooperate with Daesh, but in fact, Daesh would be a main challenge to the rule of Taliban, because they are entirely different in their philosophy, goals and objectives, and their tactics. The Daesh is very extreme. The Taliban are not extreme.
Joe Biden, he said the U.S. has to leave because the U.S. succeeded in its counterterrorism mission. Well, if we look at the last days, that doesn't seem very true. And, the Taliban have expressed a wish to establish a secure, a safe, stable Afghanistan. Do you think they're going to be able to succeed in that?
Well, I think, yes. Well, I should say to, President Biden or the U.S. government that they should not have been in Afghanistan in the first place. And if they went and attacked, they should have left in 2002, because the objectives they said were then, achieved. And then they should have left, after they assassinated bin Laden in 2011 or 2010, was it, in Pakistan, not in Afghanistan. And so I think it was time. Biden would like, for his own sake, because Biden is in deep, deep trouble, and so are all the Democrats. So they need to get as much credit for themselves as they can. So there were no terrorists, because, as I said, the Taliban themselves, I think, cannot afford to either, harbor or support or accommodate terrorists, because the Taliban, again, has a different trajectory and different objective. That is, they want to form a nation state. And they keep saying, we need help. We need to have good relationship with the whole world. We need their assistance. We need this and we need that. They need credibility. So the Taliban are in no position. But Biden keeps saying, and I think in the way to deal with terrorism is a tactic. I mean, terrorism is not a group. It's not a party. It's not a government. It's not a war as such. but it's a crime. It's a crime that I think should be dealt with in other ways through police work, intelligence, which the United States has. And actually, the Taliban have said that even they will work with the U.S. government, to solve these problems. They're on record. If Washington would agree to this, but Washington, so as I said again, for its own reasons, is determined to destabilize and keep destabilizing Afghanistan because, as I said, this is typical imperialism, neo-colonialism that would not allow countries to become self-sufficient, especially countries that would not make its resources, markets, and labor and so forth to Western imperialism. And that's the issue.
Dr. Wahab, thank you so much for your time. Really insightful, really great speaking with you.
Medhurst, thank you very much, and thank you for asking me. Good luck.
In light of this tragic attack, there are several important questions, uncomfortable questions that need to be answered. First, why did the United States move its evacuation operations to the international airport, creating a security situation with packed crowds and increasing the likelihood that an attack could happen? Just last month, on July 1st, the United States suddenly left Bagram Air Base. In the middle of the night, it cut off the power and left without even telling the Afghan security forces who were supposed to take over, nor its own allies. Bagram Air Base is not only much more capable, but much larger than Kabul's international airport. And if the U.S. knows that thousands of people need to be evacuated, why did it abandon its biggest airbase in Afghanistan, a military, secured airbase, and go instead and hijack Kabul's international airport, a much smaller, unprotected, and much more dangerous place? This doesn't make any sense at all. Moreover, if the United States and its allies knew that a terrorist attack on the airport was imminent, why wasn't more done to secure the perimeter and prevent a tragic thing like this from happening? How can U.S. President Joe Biden and his Secretary of State Blinken claim that the U.S. succeeded in its counterterrorism mission in Afghanistan, and then on the way out, 170 people are killed because of a terrorist attack? That doesn't really look like the counterterrorism mission was much of a success, and certainly not the nation-building aspect of it. In response to the attack, Biden maintained that the withdrawal would continue. However, he signaled that he had authorized the U.S. military to draw up plans to strike assets and targets belonging to Daesh. The following day, it's reported that the U.S. launched a drone strike, killing 2 members of Daesh and wounding another. The thing is, the United States has a long history of supporting and arming terrorist groups whose objectives align with its foreign policy. For example, in the 1980s, the U.S. helped train and fund the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, some of whom went on later to form Al-Qaeda. Even Hillary Clinton admits this. And then 9/11 happens, orchestrated by the same people that the U.S. funded, and the U.S. goes to war for 2 decades under the guise of a war on terror. But it's a war of terror. Millions are killed, millions displaced in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and elsewhere. And even though they had nothing to do with 9/11, the U.S. goes and bombs Iraq and Afghanistan and has bombed 19 countries total. Meanwhile, the only winners left, the only people who benefited from all this, are the weapons dealers. The U.S. spent trillions of dollars. And where did those dollars go? They went to line the pockets of people who make jets, bombs, and uniforms. How convenient for them. So before the U.S. armed the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, there was no Al-Qaeda. And before the U.S. invaded Iraq and then Syria, there was no Daesh. So when the U.S. claimed it was leaving Iraq in 2011, and all of a sudden Daesh pops out of nowhere, no thanks to covert U.S. support, and of course the power vacuum which resulted after the invasion in 2003, then all of a sudden, conveniently, the U.S. has a reason to go back into Iraq. And they're still there to this day, a decade later. The U.S. entered Iraq again under the guise of counterterrorism. It claimed it will be conducting quote-unquote limited strikes as well inside of Syria to fight Daesh. Well, first of all, the U.S. has no permission to be in Syria. And when they said limited strikes, we know how that turned out. The U.S. has troops on the ground inside Syria, illegally occupying the country and also controlling 90% of Syria's oil. If that's their idea of limited strikes on Daesh, what does that mean then in the case of Daesh-K in Afghanistan? So one day it's Al-Qaeda, then it's Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and then it's Al-Qaeda in Syria, then it's Daesh, and now it's Daesh-K. The U.S. has an extraordinary knack for finding new threats to deal with, which magically keep the war on terror going, the U.S. empire expanding, and most important of all, money flowing to the pockets of the weapons dealers. So pay attention and watch out, lest they exploit and take advantage of this latest tragedy at Kabul airport to try and prolong the war, as some of these national security ghouls and warmongers would love to do. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Richard Medhurst, and this is the Communiqué.